So we're going to start off. My name is Jason Church. I'm a materials conservator with the National Center for Preservation, Technology, and Training in Natchitoches. I heard the people earlier in the last session were introducing themselves as to how they got started in all this, so I'm going to throw mine in too. I was in undergrad at Appalachian State University and ran an antiques mall, and in that mall we had a dealer named Howard Campbell. I don't know if anyone here knew Howard. He was a collector of folk art extraordinaire. I think Slotin did 4 days auction when he passed away, just to clear out what had been left of his estate. Thousands of pieces. And he asked me if I would help him work at an auction one day, and I said, sure. I was off. What the heck? Make a little extra money. Sounds like fun. And I went to his house, and he proceeded to load the entire back of his truck with Finster paintings. And I'd never seen anything like it. And they were mostly the plexiglass boxes. Everybody's nodding. You guys all know what I'm talking about. And it blew me away. I'd never seen anything like it. And then he started loaning me books by the truckload. And I started reading after that, and then started going with him to meet artists and see sites. And that was my introduction to it. And I was doing an art history minor at the time. And luckily, my professor knew about art environments and loved them, and had grown up near one that's no longer existent in Bath, North Carolina. And he said as soon as the lady who he loved, she had her entire house filled with dolls, tens of thousands. They hung from the ceilings. They were painted. They were plastered to the walls. He said the day she died, the family burned the house down. So that was my introduction not only to folk art and environments, but to the ephemeral nature of these sites and how important they were. So I've sort of been on my mind all through my conservation training. So today we're going to talk about working with living artists, and we've all had the pleasure of working with living artists. And we've talked about a lot of these sites as in older sites, what do we do with them now? So we're going to sort of switch gears and talk about working with sites when the artist is still there. So I'm going to start off talking about Juanita Leonard. And so she's a self-taught artist in Montgomery, Louisiana, which is just a tiny little village not far from Natchitoches. Juanita is a amazingly pleasant person. She is really fun-loving, loves people to come visit her. The whimsy of her personality is in everything she does. And this is a great picture. I took this just a couple of days before this conference. She had just made her monkey sculpture, and she said she made this because as a little girl, all she ever wanted was a pet monkey, and her mom wouldn't let her have it. So she was very happy that she finally has her pet monkey that she's always wanted. So she was very proud of the sculpture. So she let me take a picture of her with it. So give you a little sort of peek into Juanita's world. So this is the house that she lives in. It's constructed of her own doing. This is the interior. The entire interior is like this. Furniture, floor, ceiling, walls, everything's painted. Kitchen cabinets, everything's painted or constructed by her. Light fixtures, everything. This is the second house on the property. The first house on the property, she doesn't live anymore. She uses it for storage, but it was like this as well. She also has 2 churches on the property. She's a deeply religious person, and that's what drives her to do this. She wants people to stop, talk to her so that she can witness to them, and then she holds church and has a pretty sizable congregation at her church each Sunday, and I'll show you her church in a second. And that is what I'm going to talk about today, is just her church. So the whole site is an environment, the yard, the property behind it, her houses. But I'm just going to focus today on the church. So when I met her going on 10 years ago, this is what the church looked like. So this is just one side of the outside. And these are the angel sculptures that she had. And they're made out of discarded bandaging material from the local doctor's offices. So these are just the standard cast wrappings, soaked in plaster Paris and then painted. And when I met her, I was really intrigued by these, and they sort of supported themselves. They're heavily screwed onto the plywood, and you can sort of see they're sitting partially resting on, the disposable pots for plants. And I talked to her about it, and already some were slumping, and you can see one that's been taken down. You know, if it's not bolted down, it has hardly any shape to itself, and it sort of falls over these boxes. And we talked a long time, and she asked me, what do I do? And I explained to her I was a conservator, and she was very interested in what that was. So we had a long, in-depth conservation, about conservation, about what we do as conservators to try to save sculptures like this and things like that. So the next time I came to visit her, they were all gone. And she had replaced them with metal. And I was shocked, and some of them are actually behind the metal. They've just been bolted over top of the plaster Paris ones that you saw. And I said, you know, what happened to the other angels? She said, well, Jesus sent you to talk to me, and I now know that I should build out of more rigid materials. And I thought, I don't know if that's good or bad. And it really sort of bothered me. And I think that's sort of one of the things I wanted to bring to the discussion table is, you know, did I have a negative or positive effect, or should I have had any effect? Now I tell people I work at the university if they ask, if I visit a site, I work at the university. But that's what became of this is, and this is a photograph of her. What she does is she cuts them out with scissors. These are modified tin shears, and then she stitches these together. So they're multiple pieces. She takes a hammer and nail and knocks holes in them and then stitches them with baling wire together. So these statues are sewn together. Yeah, Miss Juanita's forearms are like this big. It's amazing to watch her cut. This is roofing, corrugated roofing tin. To watch her cut it with scissors is amazing. But so that's sort of the transition that started to happen because, as she said, Jesus centered me to her to explain to her that materials weather and that she needs to change her materials. This is the same church. So the metal angels are now gone because she realized, well, what's even more permanent than metal? Stone, concrete. So it has switched gears yet again. This is how it looks currently. It's a little different. She's redoing the walkway and has added more sculptures in front of it right now. But this is essentially what we have now, which is, she told me, well, don't worry, not all the angels are gone. Some of them are still under there. So some of them are still there. Some of them are in a pile, and a lot of the metal ones have been sold off. But that's that ever constant changing site. So we also talked about not only the theoretical debate of did I have an influence and was that good or bad, but we talked a lot about how these sites change. So this is only in the span of 10 years. This has gone through 3 or 4 different iterations. Everything on that site changes. And it's why it's really important. We talked about Pasaquan yesterday in the panel. We were talking, one day if we have to go back, let's say in the future, and we're going to conserve this site, what do we go back to? Do we go back to the plaster Paris angels? Do we go back to the metal ones? Do we go back to the stone? What's it going to look like next? And that's why it's really important, if you're working with sites like this, to photograph them all the time. And then I really want to put a plug in for Spaces. If you're not familiar with it, go check out the website. But to donate documentation, because these things are constantly changing. Like they were talking about Finsters yesterday, how many times that one sign moved around the property. And this is the sort of current iteration. She's doing these concrete angels, and she's putting them on poles. She said she wants everything off the ground now. That's her current method, and she wants them all on poles up in the air, and the higher the better. So these are her current angels that she's making as we speak, and they'll all be completely painted eventually and on poles. So that's where we're going, and you can see the church in the background, and that's still the church she has service in. And there's a really great picture by Fred, kind of near the back of the inside of her church. I didn't include any pictures of that, sorry. And then, part of it is, did she change because now that someone's introduced her to conservation, did I have a negative or positive sort of influence on the art? Or maybe it's just, as Juanita said, on one of her side of one of her houses, maybe it's just change. And, there's no no rhyme or reason to it, but it's always going to be evolving.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks, Jason. Man, that was all right, following your lead of like, how'd you get here? I'm an art historian by training, so I came through academic art history. And then I went to work in a historic preservation office of the National Park Service, so I kind of had a turn more toward architectural preservation and saving buildings and preserving buildings. And that change, I think, is something that helped to me to be more open or more interested and maybe more, the combination of things when I began looking at environments. But the first environment I was ever involved with was really the Wallace Simpson Whirligig site in Lucama, North Carolina, about, I guess it was 2010 when that project began. You'll hear more about that later. And basically to help them, I run a historic preservation, sculpture and monument preservation assistance branch for the Park Service in Philadelphia. So I was asked to come in and help advise them on preserving these painted metal machines. So I got involved and brought Ron in, and we've been working on that project in the years since. Through another project, working on a very traditional bronze conservation project, brought me out to Great Bend, Kansas, and the people I got to know at the Historical Society there had been working on a project looking at Hoisington, Kansas. And Hoisington is a small community north of Great Bend, part of Barton County, and it had been sort of the part of the county that everybody made fun of. All right, it's where the railroad workers lived. It's where the bordellos were. It was the sort of joke of the county. So the Historical Society decided, well, let's learn about cultural resources in Hoisington, and they began interviewing people, a fairly sizable Mexican community. Many of them had lived in discarded boxcars that had been converted into living spaces. And one of the women, who was a multi-generation Mexican family, is married to an Anglo guy who has been making cemetery monuments out of concrete for about the last decade or so. So when we talk about working with a living artist, this is a new person. Most of us are used to working with people who are gone, in some cases long gone. I mean, we were fortunate to be able to work with Wallace when he was still alive. This guy, I mean, the measure of all things is oneself. So this guy's younger than I am. You know what I mean? So, and he's just begun making these constructions. This is the first one that he made. Now, what he was trying to do here is he was noticing in his local cemetery that there were many graves that had very minimal markings. Most of them had only these little funeral parlor notice, these little metal things with the changeable letters. And even he noticed that some of these were very old. In some cases, they'd been replenished, but they were sometimes 20 and 30 years old. So he took it upon himself to begin, I guess about a dozen years ago, making these concrete monuments. And a lot of what he did would do research, because he didn't know these people. He had no connection personally with these people. So he would try to find out whatever he could find out. And this woman, Creola Paxton, all he could find out was she died in 1947. He'd met some people who knew her, and all he knew was that she loved sewing. So that's what he put on her marker. He would make these out of reinforced concrete and then selectively paint them. Here's a child's grave. There was a marking for a child who had died, I'm assuming probably at birth or very soon after. And he would create this figure. He had this, and he describes this as a holy man. He doesn't go beyond that with a description of it. But with these children's graves, there's usually a figure that's holding an infant. He puts these concrete foundations and then puts his assembly on top. Really love this one. This is Leela Bailey. All he knew about her was that her husband had predeceased her. So in creating that, he created two figures. He's already up above waiting for her. Yeah.
Who's the artist?
I'm sorry, Phil Webb. I should have. Get into it. All right. Yeah, Philip Webb is the artist. He works for a cable company making cable. I mean, he basically manufactures cable in Hoisington, Kansas. And at this point, he's done about a dozen of these in his local cemetery. Elmo Johnson Sr., what he found out about him was that he'd been a railroad worker and had served in the Navy. So it's the kind of thing you would find in an online obituary oftentimes. And so that informs a lot of these. So he decided to do two figures, one representing Mr. Johnson as a young man in the Navy, and the other as a retired railroad worker. And there's a patriotic component to a lot of these. He seems to focus a lot on that. This one, Neil Williams, this is one of his more recent ones. Neil Williams apparently has no tie to Hoisington, Kansas at all. He's from Missouri, and Phil doesn't know why he's buried there, but he is. And he was able to do some research in military records and found out that he had been shot down during World War II and captured, spent time in a prisoner of war camp, knew what the name of the airplane was. I found a picture of the plane online, and he knew what kind of commendations Neil had gotten. So he represented those commendations as well as a portrait of Neil on his monument. The reason I know this is one of his more recent ones too is that he said that initially he was making these large monolithic ones all in one piece, but they were so heavy to move out to the cemetery. He makes them in his garage, moves them out to the cemetery. Now he makes them in pieces, and he assembles them on site. This one, what he began working with, the only thing that was sticking in the ground was that little United Spanish War veterans bronze cross with the flag. That was the only thing that indicated that there was a grave there. So he had no idea who that was even, so he did research and got the names of all of the people from Hoisington who served in the Spanish-American War, figuring, okay, it's got to be one of them. And he created this monument that is taking its lead from the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So, it's an unknown person, and that spun him in the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and that's the form that he used, right down to the inscription that's on the Tomb of the Unknown. He reproduced on the side of his monument, complete with the proper phrase breaks and everything. So he's doing a lot of research. He's online all the time. I mean, so here's another source of information for people working today. This is the only one so far that has been a commission piece. I don't know if he's actually paid for it, but someone asked him to make this for Dwayne Dedder, who just died. He was a bass player, and there's the name of his band behind and a couple of speakers. I found him online too. He was part of Ronnie and the Rockets, and they were a cover band that tours central Kansas. And so Ronnie's wife asked Phil to make a monument for him. Within the last couple of years, I first met Phil probably, I want to say 4 years ago. And I've talked to him twice now. And between the time that I first met him and went back, he's kind of been discovered by public television in Kansas. There's a long-running series called Sunflower Journeys. They went out there, interviewed him, took the video. Several local newspapers have talked with him, so he's become better known. Someone posted something about him on my Facebook feed, so there's more, people are knowing him more. During this period of time, since people have been coming to see him, he's returned and has repainted a lot of things that he had just done a few years before, sometimes freshening up color, sometimes adding different colors, sometimes adding paint where there hasn't been color before. He's been doing a lot of brighter pink now than he seems. Some of the pinks may have faded, but he's using a more vibrant palette in a lot of ways. This particular one, to Ida Mae Richardson, Another Child Grave, there was no painting on the text that shows her name. He's gone back recently and has added that. The Spanish-American War figure, initially I think that was a fairly low-key color of the whole uniform. He's gone back and is articulated in a different way. This really gets back to Jason's point. When you're working with, when we're working with artists who've been gone for a long time, these things are fixed. They are with the piece that we see. But when you're working with somebody who's ongoing, it's moving, it's changing a lot, and I think Jason's is a clear example working with Juanita. Well, Phil is changing a lot as well, so the importance of being there to be documenting, I think, is probably the biggest contribution we could make to be able to at least have a record of that stuff. Here's one that he just recently painted again too. Changed the color of the road from white to it may have been a pale blue to a darker blue. Changed the color of the stone to a gray. So these things are in a flex, even though, as I say, these things are no more than about 12 years old. And in the changes, they change, the aspect of them changes, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that he's going out and he's painting these things out in the cemetery as opposed to being able to work on his bench in the comfy confines of his garage. You can see there's a real difference. I mean, this figure feels differently. He's has done like a sort of a secondary blanket. The infant is more enclosed, is less exposed in a way. The face is really different. You don't have that. Those eyes are really different now. The skin. So they go through changes. All the more reason to really catch these different moments in terms of documentation. He's also begun to make a garden at home now, and he's apparently on the verge of retiring. I think when that happens, you're going to see a lot more. But this is the Google Earth view. His house is the one with the brown roof right on the corner, and you can see his garage building, and then all around that is the garden. He recently took down a greenhouse because he said he wanted additional space. He's using these limestone constructions, mostly butterfly bushes. He's talked a lot about using butterfly bushes, and he's peopling this with all these different historical figures. Some are self-portraits, different figures doing different activities. And this stuff has a much kind of lighter, much more whimsical quality than the work he's doing in the cemeteries. The earliest one he said he did there was the Abraham Lincoln with his arms outstretched, George Washington Carver on the left. So I'm just beginning to kind of understand what he likes. I'm trying to sort of approach him and draw him out a little bit at a time. He's very friendly, but he's very reserved too. And then God, he described that as being God on the right, sitting on his fence. This is another one. It's part of a larger assemblage that he was going to begin working on of a bird watcher not knowing that there was a bird sitting on his hat. So, and then this one, which I think is really, and this one you were very fond of this one. Right? These two guys carrying this giant limestone, piece of field stone from the fields of Kansas, and then a woman behind hoisting one up over her head. And he said, people think that she's gonna throw it at them. And he said, that's never what I meant. I just meant that it takes two men to do what this woman can do by herself. But he's constructing these little stories that people sometimes get or sometimes don't. But these are these figures. They're all reinforced concrete. He's got iron rods running from one guy to another to support the weight of the stone. So where is he coming from? He's coming from a lot of places. He's very tuned in. As I say, he's online, he's doing research. He does murals too. You can see that he really works color the way a painter does in a lot of ways. There's a lot of nuance to the color. He also has done murals. He did a mural for a pediatrician's waiting room, and he did research to find out, well, what kind of movies are kids looking at now? So he has figures in the windows from Frozen and from all various other things. So he's very tuned into the culture around him. He's mentioned R. Crumb, and I think that there's a real tie-in between Mr. Natural and his God figure sitting on the fence. But I think Wallace and Gromit, I haven't talked to him about that, but I think Wallace and Gromit is clearly in there as well. In his garden, he decided to make a footpath of all round. He would make these round stones. He tried to figure out motifs that would work well within a round setting. And there's a little girl across the street named Lexi who said, oh, Phil, you should do a pizza. You really should do a pizza. So he did a pizza and he wrote "Hi Lexi" on it. So so there's all of this to me says he's very engaged with people. He has a really nice feeling for people, and he likes to interact. Although he's not, he's very shy, and he's becoming sort of, maybe more as people talk to him more. But he's he's friendly, but he's not a gregarious person. So I'm trying to kind of be aware of how to talk to him and try to figure out more and more about him. But it's an interesting project. It's one where it's constant change, and and I'm trying to figure out what the role is, and he's interested in making his paints last longer. So that's one of the ways I actually brought Ron in to talk with him, and Ron's going to pick it up and is going to talk both about Valis and also about Phil.
Thanks, Dennis. So my name's Ron Harvey, and I'm a conservator in private practice, and I've been a conservator for the last 37 years. I was completing an MFA in sculpture, and there was a museum studies program, and for a year, so I took a year's worth of credits instead of going to seminars and talking about why is capital A art better than small a art. So at the end of that, I went into New York with my portfolio, and being from New Jersey, I kind of like pushed my way into OK Harris and had him look at my work, and then also at Cordier and Ekstrom, because I grew up outside of Philadelphia, and I fell in love with Duchamp before I even knew what Duchamp was. I would spend times in the museums, and the large glass just, was like this point for me. So I came out after talking to Ekstrom in the gallery and just went, I don't want to do this. And I want to be a conservator. So I called the conservator I'd been working with, volunteering 3 hours a week as part of the graduate program. In those days, there was CETA money, which is white-collar welfare, and so I went back, had a 3-year funded internship, was hired as his assistant. Following year, went off to do a year at Harvard at the Peabody Museum, because my interest and desire was to be an ethnographic conservator, and they didn't exist in those days. My artwork was influenced by ethnographic art, and I was using string and chicken bones and wires and feathers and things from the ocean, and even the grounds inside my pieces I was creating were parts of beaches that I would bring I was going to school in Wisconsin, from New Jersey to, I got schlepping bags of sand. So there's a whole idea of this self-educated art seems so familiar and comfortable to me. So anyhow, that's my story. What I want to talk about is Valis Simpson, and here's a guy who, just amazing, born in 1919 in Lacoma, North Carolina. He was one of 12 children on a farm, and being a good creative kid, learned a lot of skills like welding and repair, and went off, of course, and served, because he was also someone who was a good American, and served in World War II. And he was with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Corps during the Second World War in the Pacific Theater. He was stationed in Saipan in northern Marianas Islands. And there was a problem there. It's the war, right? And these guys are all like in tropical areas and wanted to do their laundry. So Valis, being the farmer boy, said, okay. So he constructed a windmill out of parts from a junked B-29 Superfortress bomber to power a washing machine for his company. It was so good, someone stole it, and he actually built another one bigger. So he goes back to the States. His father moved houses also to make money as part of, because if you farm, you do a million things. So Valis and two of his brothers continued that business. He became known as the guy to move giant pieces of mechanical equipment, because if you're at all familiar, Wilson, which is the next town over, is like the center for tobacco in the United States, or was. He designed and built, so he worked on his moving houses and all of that until, probably until he was about in 1980s, and then retired. And then the man went crazy. So this is a sighting, and you'll see there's a water feature, and there's sections of land to either side of the water feature. That was part of the Valis farm. But I want you to remember the road that's coming down from the top, direct top, that almost, if you kept going, you'd run into the water. So Valis was making these structures, and so he was comfortable moving things like houses. Now remember, these whirligigs that he was making are kinetic and painted and complex surfaces and could be 40 or 50 feet high. And they functioned, they worked. And one of the things that Dennis and I immediately, like, there's this amazing sound when they're moving. And it could be a really gentle wind, and some of them were not functioning anymore because Wallace was now in early 90s, and was just not capable of keeping them running. But amazing. And so we have all kinds of issues like rust and attached pieces and this funny reflective stuff, and all these different levels of deterioration. And, he was using things like spray paint and not priming and painting. And, it was more about making them than keeping them. So what had happened was, since Wallace was older, the family didn't want to keep these pieces. Wallace wanted them to actually have a life, and we were hoping that they would stay in their original location. There was a group of people in town in Wilson that wanted to do an economic development project. Realized that 50% of the population in Wilson was unemployed or underemployed. Yeah. And so if they wanted to do this project of what if we acquire the whirligigs and we repair them and then move them back into a new location downtown, which would generate, and this is earlier talk of community relations, it would become a destination. It would bring people into the community because the community was suffering because tobacco industry was flat. And the people who were making money in tobacco were making it in China or in India. So they were moving things out of the country but not making money in the country. And certainly not hiring a lot of people. So the question was, again, we had these nuances. We had pieces that we see, as I love Dennis's phrase, the hand of Wallace. We see these painterly surfaces that are much more complex than these flat, big sheets with just a single color. And so the question was, there was no curator. We were brought in to kind of like, well, what do you think we should do? And we're not curators. I mean, we have ideas, and you heard my lecture earlier, if you were that this idea of having a curator and a conservator is the best. And I'd even make it a try it if I Dennis a curator and a conservator the best. So it's, are you going to end up doing, the swab and stick, which is the way people often think of conservation, bench work, or are you going to do like wholesale? We got to strip these, repaint them, reattach. How far do we go with this? What level of aesthetic compensation, restoration, do these pieces move to? And it's certainly what Jason was talking about. We're talking huge mechanical pieces that are massive and needed to move in order to be what they were. The group in town had some money, and they ended up having someone donate the use of a nice storage space. It was the Barn Street warehouse. So Dennis and I had attended NCPTT Outsider Art Conference in 1911, thank you. 2011, yeah, not that old, nor is the conference. And so Brooke Anderson, and many of you may know her, she had been the curator at the Folk Art Museum in New York, and then went to LACMA. She's since moved on. She was in New Orleans, and now she's at Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts as director. But she comes from and embraces self-taught artists. And so, being Mr. Jersey, right, like scamper up to her and like, Dennis, we got to talk to her. Brooke, we need conservation. We need to do conservation, but we need curatorial input. Would you be willing to come in and at least help us? So she was brought in by the organization and spent a couple of days talking to Danny, who was the lead mechanic. He's showing her what she's doing. And the idea was to replace where you have mechanical systems which are failed and use better systems, because these are going to be 30, 40, 50 feet in the air. They're going to need maintenance. So if you can make things as functional as possible and as long-lasting. And so they were, in the closed systems, they were end up putting little access panels or ports that they could then have screw tips to block, so you could lubricate, so you could actually plot out on these pieces what had to be maintained in terms of the mechanical side. And Brooke got to meet and spend some time with Wallace and actually to keep him occupied as Dennis is
I'm shooting pictures.
yeah,
That's
he's
right,
taking things off the wall, don't believe him. So it was really great, and Wallace reminded me so much. I live in Maine and have for the last 29 years. As a Mainer, very limited, he would, saying, do you want these things to remain the way they are and rusty, and I can encapsulate that and keep that. I don't know why you're worried about the rust. And so through conversations and through multiple.
Grease is more important than paint.
Yeah, grease is more important than paint. Another one of his great lines. That his idea was, they should work and they should be quiet and they should look the way they were. So not only did we have the blessing in terms of the move of the piece, and again, I say we're the outsiders. We're not driving the project, and although we're trying to influence the project. So it was really neat because often we don't have that opportunity to talk to the artist, to have him say, moving them's okay. Do they have to be the same location, location to one another? No. So what we wanted to do was to try and have a system in terms of conservation that would implement color that were accurate and systems that would be long-term stable. And one of the things that Brooke brought, we're struggling because some of these pieces are so fragile. And Brooke, in her curatorial wisdom, said, aren't they talking about some sort of a museum space? And I said, yeah, they're vacillating. She said, why don't you keep those pieces that are most fragile and they can be indoors? And at some point, perhaps do intervention, stabilize paint, stabilize rust, and replicate them and put the replicas out on these massive pieces. So you have that ability to have the viewer see the most original materials at eye level rather than 30, 40, 50 feet, and preserve those aspects, especially things like hand painting and stuff. So remember I was saying, remember that road, how it comes into that point, which was Wallace's land? So as you're driving up at night, this is what you saw. All those little colored pieces were highway signs that he cut up, different colors, attached them. So at night, these pieces were not only kinetic, but they were lit up. And locally it was known as Acid Park. Go figure, right? So here you see the piece in the larger photograph, or the piece upper right is the time machine piece, is 2010, and on the bottom it's prepped to go up. So the idea was, what are we going to do in terms of this paint? And the paint you're seeing here on the new material is a primer and paint system that's an epoxy paint, primer, and a siloxane top paint. So you're getting probably 20 years of longevity at least. These are paints that were designed for outdoor use in terms of bridges, and the oldest example is the Niagara Bridge. And I talked to the science side of the company that produces this paint, and she said, Ron, the paint will hold up well. It's long life. We say 10 to 15, 20 years, but she said, I can show you examples that are 30, 35 years. And it's also retreatable. So the idea is that there's a paint system on there that's going to protect the surface. The mechanical systems have been replaced. So it shows the best of Wallace when Wallace was younger and when the pieces were vibrant. And it goes into a park downtown and opens in November.
First week of November.
And if you Google Vala Simpson, Whirligigs, you'll get more than you want. You'll get website information. You'll get the site that the park is running in Wilson, and you can get more information about him and see more transition of the pieces. So, you know, struggling with a living artist. So the others, Dennis and I were working on a World War I monument in Kansas, and he said, "Come on, let's go. I need to interview this guy. Let's go." And you'd like to meet him. So here's his studio. It's a really neat space, and he's using he's not using ferrous metal armatures. He's doing really great work in terms of the plaster or the masonry, the concrete. And again, yeah, we have similar taste. What a surprise! And again, see, I never thought she was throwing it. I just thought it was like, come on, boys, can't you like each carry a stone? And again, we saw this not only, as I'm looking at it as a conservative, not only the failing paint and the adjustment, but the nuancing, the way he's mixing paint and painting in a very painterly manner. And I was saying, Phil, you know, you're going to lose this. You're spending so much time working on this, and you're using materials that may not hold up well. And, you know, can I suggest something? And he went, yeah, you know, I really want to know more. I said, well, talk to the people at Golden. Golden Paints has been working voraciously on research and testing and documenting their acrylic paints and their top coat acrylic resin UV inhibitor surfaces for outdoor murals. And none of the pieces of Phil's work exhibit rising damp, so we're not having that problem. It's mostly weathering and fading. And so I know he's contacted them, I know he's switched over. So I am, on one level, the conundrum of, you know, it is interaction, it is a level of knowledge rather than interference. Again, coming out of fine arts, artists always adopt. They're, you know, it's not unusual to see artists like Bernard Langley go from 2D work to 3D work, or 3D work to 2D work. So I think the material part is interesting, and the artists that I've talked to outside of conservation are always interested in learning about new materials and techniques. So if we can provide information and not interfere, not try to push or pull their aesthetics. Oh, you know, if you used a Prussian blue, you didn't. No. This is their work, you know. And again, coming from fine arts, being trained as a conservator, I truly believe in leaving that aesthetic self-righteousness at the door. You know, I'm there as a visitor, and you know, we're privileged to be able to work on this art, and with that comes responsibility. Thanks.
So questions, comments in the audience?
How old is Joe Webb? roughly?
I think he's about 61, probably.
61.
Yeah, about that 60, 61, yeah.
Yeah, he's young.
Yeah, he's young. He's a mere strapling.
Yeah.
And I have another quick question. Who called on Ronald and Dennis to go to North Carolina to work on the Simpson works?
That was,
Henry?
it was Janet. Yeah, there was an arts administrator who was initially working on the project and was putting it together. So she had reached out to me with the National Park Service because she knew that we had an assistance program for outdoor sculpture. Yeah,
At the very local level in North Carolina.
Very local
They reached
level.
out to National Park Service and
Yeah,
found you.
because we had an assistance program. I think they initially thought assistance meant cash, and then she found out that it didn't. But I said, well, I think we can still help you anyway. You know, so
Okay.
that was how we first were contacted.
And who ultimately paid for your services, you and Ronald's services?
Your tax dollars paid for my participation.
But did
The,
the Wilson, at the local level, did their arts committee or arts council pay your services?
no, I was paid through the foundation, which was the group of 5 people in the city, in the town, who were, multi-generational people that were employed and did have money and saw the need to help. And so they were the ones that, they were, basically, it was coming out of Henry's pocket.
Yeah, they had already begun raising money about the same time. They actually got a very nice NEA grant,
Yeah.
which brought them, visibility as well as money. And so they had begun to put some local money together through a local bank, who made a contribution. So yeah, they were starting to put the pieces together around 2010.
And most of that funding was not for conservation, but it was for employment of these people to work to do the mechanical part. So again, it was a job-based initiative. And then I was brought in periodically.
Okay. So the last thing is, you said the park will open officially in November?
Hi, I'm Anna Quinlivan. I also am a SCAD alum, like Jason. I worked in the cemeteries in New Orleans doing tomb conservation, and I guess one of the interesting things around Phil's work is the idea of people using cemeteries as places to visit again. And so I guess the conservation aspect of that is that the more he's there maintaining the work, the more active the site is and the more engaged people are in like cemetery preservation and visiting it as a social site. So I don't know, it's just the thought of like, I love that aspect of it. I love tomb and monument conservation, and I really love, there are some paupers fields in New Orleans that like, yeah, do you know, they have like, they're really cool. They have spaces there where families can make their own headstones for people. Yeah. So it's not tombs. I mean, they're, to say they're horribly maintained is an understatement, but they're really cool the way that people engage with the sites. And I think it's really interesting to, for us to be talking about that in this conservation stuff.
Well, it's
But
interesting.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on
It's
that.
interesting there too, because Kansas is a great environment because it's very clean and it's very dry. So you got a good shot in terms of longevity of materials. Being part of a government agency, one of the things I asked Phil was, I said, well, did you get permission? Who did you contact? And he said, no. I said, this guy from the city drove by and I was working in my garage and he stopped in and he said, were you the guy that's been making those things in the cemetery? And he said, yeah, is that okay? He goes, oh yeah, man, we really like them. So, and that was the extent of the whole permitting process. This is, it's a windswept little. It's the only cemetery in town. Very sort of minimal markers. And these are not wealthy people. But he's enlivened it, and I'm just fascinated to see where it goes from here.
Hi, I'm Paula Addington from Intuit, Chicago. I'm wondering how the artist, Phil goes about negotiating with the family or not, just to go ahead and do something on someone's grave. Does he ask for permission, or? I mean, I realize some of them are so old that that there's
almost
probably
all
no
of them
one
are.
there to.
Yeah, there's been no connection, except for a couple of them, no connection with family. He's just basically done this on his own. There's some others where he's got his eye on a spot where he knows there's somebody, and he'll go in advance of making anything, and he'll put a concrete pad. So he stakes out spots for the future, right? But and he doesn't know, he doesn't know the families, and I'm really fascinated, especially, and I wanted to ask him more about this one, the one with the little girl where he went and put the pink. Well, between the first and second times I was there, that same family lost a child 60 years later, and there's another child grave right next to it. And it's made out of stone. Looks like it's homemade. I said to Phil, did you make that? And he said, no. The family must have made this themselves. They're incorporating this pink paint like Phil was. So whether I don't think there's a dialogue in reality between people there at that point, but there certainly is a dialogue among memorials. And so that's one of the things. But again, there are some things I haven't wanted to plumb too much with you because I don't know him that well. yet. I mean, he began doing these things, I think, shortly after he lost a brother who he was very close to. And I think that was one of the things that maybe began. But again, there's a lot of personal stuff I haven't really felt comfortable broaching yet with him. So.
Hi, I'm Fred Scruton. This is a little off topic, but a great story about Vallis Simpson is that Miss Jean, his widow, and their son told me, this may be well known, I don't know, that he got started back in the States by building something like a fan or a air conditioning system for the house where they lived, and there was parts of it that were spinning around, and that the school buses would go by and the kids would get a great kick out of it. And then he appreciated the attention, and that's what started him on the whole big monumental whirligig gig, so to speak.
I hadn't heard that, but it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
You know, his affinity for kids is really strong, too. It was. Yeah.
And there's a similar story that when he was younger, I mean, high school age, that he built some sort of a fan for a window to move some air through the house because it's hot and humid there. And there was a smoke issue. Something was happening outside, and his mother's like, you can't do this anymore. So he stopped. You know, that came out of the window. It wasn't used. But again, it was a whirligig system. It wasn't electric. So we had to digress, when I was at the Milwaukee Public Museum as conservator, I had a volunteer who was in his early 80s, who was a farmer and had been working with GE Medical in their really high-end X-ray. This guy had no college education, but he was the most intuitive engineering type person that I've ever met. And he would help me with problems I would have in conservation. You know, like, how can I do this? And he'd do that farmer thing. He'd come up with a rational way of doing it that fit within the confines of conservation. And I just really learned to respect those people. My father-in-law's deceased, was a Bell Telephone scientist who never went to college, and just a brilliant guy and held 3 patents. So they're out there.
There are a couple of guys who are working on the Vallis project, doing mostly the engineering component, and we kind of feel with them, we've got the closest thing to Vallis that we're going to have, because their brains work very much like Vallis's brain works, and so and they've been with the project the whole time, and have been, and they're their own little comment. It's like click and clack. I mean, there's this byplay. They've known each other forever, and there's this really interesting byplay. But there's a lot of day-to-day problem solving that was going on there. Yeah.
Jeff, you should introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Please. Yeah.
I'm Jeff Bell. I'm the executive director of the Vallis Simpson Whirligig Park and Museum, which is what the nonprofit is called now. Originally, it was a nonprofit called Wilson Downtown Properties that started and then at some point they realized that this is really a standalone thing. And so 2.5 years ago, the organization I worked for was created. But yes, the guys in conservation are incredible, and they're also storytellers, so they got to know Vallis, and when people come in, they can tell stories about Vallis, and also spending time with them, they have their own interpretations. They've looked at these things so much that you can see these autobiographical references in the work, things that relate to Vallis and his life and things in the community, and also the materials. They're very much a historical record of the things that are around in the area. So being able to hear their take on all of these things is a pretty incredible thing.
Shortly after Vallis died, they put that little sign up on the board that says WWVD. What would Vallis do? But it was. I think we were very fortunate to have had him participate as much as we did. So.
Here.
Troublemaker. Yeah.
Jason, just real quick, how did you actually meet Juanita? Was it, a divine intervention?
No.
Yes.
Margaret Allen did an article in Folk Art Messenger years ago, and I was reading it and realized, wait, and Google mapped it and was like, that's 20 minutes from here. I think I'll drive out. And just drove out and sort of saw it, but didn't stop. And then Shane Rasmussen, who's the head of the Folklife Center at the university that we're connected to, had been out and met her once. So he took me out. Like I was telling Dr. Smith yesterday, I'm not going to stop at anybody's house unless I know them. That's just not something I would do. But so he took me out, and after that, I go out there, fairly regularly and visit her. So, yeah.
One of the things we really haven't talked about, which may be slightly tangential, but is how the relationship that we have with the artist is a little different than with an artist that is part of the mainstream and understands how the art world works, capital A, capital W. I find that you can't do a drive-by with these artists. You have to spend the time, and you're taking a lot from them. You're taking an amazing amount of their time, even if you're talking to them while they're working. You're taking their time, you're asking them questions, and you're coming back again and again, and therefore, in my humble opinion, you owe them. And you owe them to be respectful of their work and professional with how you treat it. And you also owe them to come to their aid if they need it. And that means that if somebody's threatening Juanita's place, then you're going to step up and try to help save it, or you're going to help try to work with her to make it happen so that she's comfortable with what happens next with it. And it's a really very different relationship. I find that I've, over the course of so many years working with some of the same artists for almost 20 years, not only am I seeing them every year, but I'm, sending presents when the grandkids are born, or I'm speaking at the funeral, or it's just a very, very different relationship, and I think we have to understand that if we're going to get into this, we need to know that we are making a commitment of our time as well, because we can't just take. We have to give back to them in the way that they need us to give back to them.
Yeah, I promised Juanita a long time ago that if she dies, that I'll come camp out to keep anybody from tearing it down. Because she told me, when I die, the community will bulldoze this place. So it's like, all right, I promise I'll be here, like to camp out and chain myself to it or whatever.
Yeah.
Because there's definitely that aspect.
I actually have a question. So we've talked a lot about your influence on artists who you're working with, and I'm wondering if you feel like your own practice as conservators have been influenced through working with living artists, and if so, how?
Well, again, because I came in through the back door, that sense of respect for the artist and what the artist is creating and the creation process. I can tell you it will influence me when I stop doing conservation and start making sculpture again, and that's down the road. I dream about it. So, but I think that again, I think with conservation, for me, my view of conservation is that I'm so involved in the dance of the material, the artist, the aesthetics, the longevity, the ability to try and do unnatural acts to extend the life of these pieces. And because I was using weird materials in my work, it seems very, very familiar. So I feel more at home working with these artists or with their art than I did on some levels being in a lab with a table and wearing a lab coat and doing the swab thing. I mean, I love both, but mostly, and when Terry hired me, he said, well, you're working for us. And I went, you're paying me, but I work for the art. And she would, and I've had other clients say, well, can you do this? And I said, no, the art's telling me it does not want to go that way. So it's reading the art and being being that intermediary. And again, my training, in the museum was that you are also a representative of the art. So I was the only voice in the room that was talking for the piece. And I feel that way when we go into the field all the time. I have to couch it. I have to be, I can't be aggressive. If I draw a line in the sand and someone's on the other side, I'll never get them back. So it's, education is a subversive activity. Let me have some time with them. Let me see if I can communicate to them what I'm seeing. And sometimes the advantage of being the outsider, the person from away, gives me more power so that I can hopefully do the right thing. If that makes sense.
Yeah. See, something that actually dawned on me just right now is, all three of us are coming out of traditions of creating and making things. My advanced degrees are in art history, but I started out as a studio major, and I'm thinking back, the sculpture I was doing at Florida State, and I was using, pieces of like horseshoe crab carcasses and string and all this. So I think, and you're a maker. That's where you came from.
Good night, sculpture.
So all of us are coming out of that, ultimately out of that touchy stuff and making and thinking and designing. So, I think maybe, and that's probably true for a lot of people who are gravitating toward this field, so.
And for me, I'd only visited, all the sites like we've been talking about, these sort of long deceased, frozen, somewhat stagnant sites. And I didn't realize the change, that these are living, breathing sites, and the artist is more than half the art themselves. And that, and I'll go there and I sort of have small panic attacks because I was just there, and some of my favorite sculptures that were wooden, she's throwing them on the ground, she's using them for support for something else. You're like, but I love that one. Oh, I'm done with that. I don't, and so sometimes I can talk her into letting me buy some of the older ones before she turns them into something else or throws them out. But it's got to evolve. You can't say, no, you got to stick with wood. They're really cool.
So when you start to think that your influence is too overwhelming, realize that she'll do what she wants.
Oh, absolutely.
She'll take, she'll not take. They're the ones deciding. It's almost like a little arrogant of us to think that we're that we're calling that shot. Ultimately they're going to do what they want to do.
They're strong-willed people.
Yeah.
I've never met an artist that was like, oh, okay, I'll do that. You're never going to make it. I'm sorry. Step aside.
Yeah, she's at least half the artwork is her. And kind of like, I've been looking at Prophet Isaiah's, Fred introduced me and I went out to, and it's an awesome site, and we spent about half an hour there, but then I spent probably 4 hours with the Prophet. He's the art as much as that is, if not more.
I work a lot with Joe Minter and his site in Birmingham, the African Village, and it is, Joe's getting older and his interests have sort of taken him more and more away from the site. But bringing people there that have seen the photos and trying to get them interested in the site, I, as not a conservator, I struggle with language when people say, oh, this is in such rough shape, like how can you even save it, or like what is the point, or and I'm just wondering if, as conservators that have done this, you have any advice for how to convey not just the importance, which I can, but the feasibility, or like how to just get people to stop saying immediately this is impossible, but sort of open doors to productive conversations.
Almost anything can be saved. So, but send us pictures. Maybe we can say, hey, this is all it would take. Because a lot of times, I don't think a lot of times there's very simple things, like just cleaning things people go, oh, this site can't be, it's too far gone. You go, well, actually, it's not that bad at all. We'd have to kind of see the...
Show them pictures of Pompeii before it was restored, or any other, amazing area. Or you can show them images from Grey Gardens that was just down the tubes and was not ever coming, except it has come back and it was just sold recently for gazillions of dollars. I think it's that nuance. How do you, when I hear someone say it can't, I always go, well, if that was true, most of the museums would be fairly empty. And they go, oh. And so you open a dialogue. And again, when you can engage them when you can bring them to a point where they may not, and I've had clients say, I don't agree, but I understand that you know this, and I don't. It's like, you're giving me permission. So, but if you can engage them, and if you can bring them to your side, even a little bit, you know, it's like, well, if your shoes get dirty, do you throw them away? And that's not art, but this is. And, you know, that this is not only art, it's space, it's this environment, it's this whole experience. And I mean, I spending 4 years at Cushing, and because it's a summer resort area, and we would get people from around the world coming in. And I can tell you, hands down, there was never a day, if someone walked on campus, I would stop, I would, you know, sometimes I had a crew of 7 working with me. I'd take them around and show them something. And they go, wow, I had no idea. I got them. They're in, they're hooked. And then these lectures we were doing, or these walk tours, we would get people coming back and bringing families. So it's getting people engaged and connected, and then say, this can, but we need help.
Well, that's, actually, Jeff, you could attest to this. That's one of the strengths of the Wallace Project, is that there was always a space where the restoration, the conservation work was being done that people could go see. You know, they can, so, you know, you don't even know what kind of positive effect you're having on the world at large, because these people go off, you don't know, they're going back to their communities or whatever, but they're seeing that it's possible, they're seing that it's doable, they get excited about it. Years ago, probably 1989, Bologna did a conservation of their big John Bologna fountain. This is the major fountain in the center of Bologna. And they had an architectural competition to design a portable conservation studio, which was put right in the piazza. It was this wooden structure. The conservators were working on the fountain in the lower level. There was a gallery, so you could go from outside as a visitor, go right up to a gallery and watch the work without ever interfering with the work, but you could participate, you could view it. And I think that was one of the best calling cards for conservation I've ever seen. You know, and I think that the Wallace Project had a lot of that as well. So, I mean, I would advocate that if you can figure out a way of working that into it, you know, it's a great opportunity.
Anyone else?
Is that orange suck? Do we suck this entire orange dry now?
Okay, thank you, everyone.